Should sanctions against Zimbabwe be lifted? The president blames US and EU embargoes for crippling the economy. Not so, say the government's critics. So who's right? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. Zimbabwe used to be known as the breadbasket of Africa. Some economists describe it now as a basket case. Inflation is at nearly 300% and millions of Zimbabweans are going hungry because they cannot afford basics. The government blames international sanctions.
Sanctions must go. Remove them now.
President Emmerson Mnangagwa declared Friday a national holiday. He urged a show to support a call on the US and the European Union to lift sanctions imposed when Robert Mugabe was leader. The ruling ZANU-pf says the restrictions are a crime against humanity and bans on government leaders and businesses are choking the economy. Opponents blame Zimbabwe's troubles on Mnangagwa's failures.
The continued judgment and setting of utopian standards for Zimbabwe, which are never applied in any other jurisdictions, are callous, vindictive, and should not be allowed to continue.
I think sanctions are unjust, especially to our economy, to everybody, because they are doing a lot of damage. Our industries are failing to function. We are failing to create jobs because every country needs funding.
I just want to know, those people, they say they are targeted. What effects are the sanctions doing to them? Or they are hurting an ordinary person like me?
Our country is on its knees. We want our economy to start to function again. They must be, they're illegal, 100% they're illegal.
The US and EU imposed sanctions against government leaders and companies nearly 20 years ago after a political crackdown by then-President Robert Mugabe. The US financial and travel restrictions applied to 56 businesses and 85 people, including President Mnangagwa. US arms exports to Zimbabwe are also banned. The EU also banned the sale of military equipment that could be used for repression and froze the assets and imposed travel bans on some Zimbabweans linked to the government. The EU extended sanctions for another year in February. The US has since imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe's State Security Minister, saying he was involved in gross violations of human rights. Let's bring in our guests in Johannesburg by Skype. Aditi Lalbahadur, Program Manager of Foreign Policy at the South African Institute of International Affairs. And in London, Patricia Chinyo, UK representative of the Zimbabwean Opposition Party Movement for Democratic Change. A representative from Zimbabwe's ruling party ZANU-pf was due to join the panel, but unfortunately had to cancel. Welcome to you. Aditi, how significant are the sanctions imposed on the Zimbabwean government?
These are sanctions that have been imposed really actually since 2000. What happens is that they continue to be updated based on persons of interest and potential sort of who's deemed to be sort of corrupt and so on. And obviously also it's been adapted to accommodate the new sort of political leadership that has taken over in Zimbabwe. There's two sets of sanctions. One that's leveled at from the EU side, which at this point in time is only really relevant to Grace Mugabe. And then there's the US sanctions, which are targeted at a specific list of individuals and companies and state-owned enterprises. And then, of course, there's the Jazeera sort of conditions, which are not sanctions necessarily, but they do impose certain restrictions on the way in which the US behaves in terms of sort of debt relief, rolling out debt relief to Zimbabwe.
Patricia, what kind of impacts do you see in the near future?
Before I actually answer that question, I wanted to thank the Zimbabwean people for standing up against the regime yesterday. I think that the stance that the current government had taken in collaboration with SADC over the no sanctions march didn't work yesterday. The people of Zimbabwe stood up and they stood against the regime. And by so doing, they sent a really big message to say, we are no longer interested in hearing your propaganda about the sanctions that they sing about all the time. And with regard to any impacts, I think that in terms of these targeted sanctions against individuals and organizations that are owned by these individuals, any lifting of those sanctions would create a very unsafe environment in Zimbabwe. And I think what we need to perhaps talk about today is the ZANU-PF imposed sanctions on the people of Zimbabwe in the form of corruption and the lack of rule of law, as well as the gross human rights violations that we have seen accelerate since 2017.
Aditi, the government was expected to see a huge number of people show up for the rally against the sanctions. That didn't happen. Could it be an indication the government is failing to sort of win the hearts and minds of its own people?
Well, yes, I think that, as my colleague has just said, I think that there's a widespread acknowledgement that there's enough is enough from the population of the general population in Zimbabwe. I think more than that, though, is that people are not really buying into the kind of rhetoric that used to fly, in previous years. And the point that we try to make when we're doing this analysis on Zimbabwe is that one of the principal failings, perhaps, of the current administration is this lack of acknowledgement of the fact that Zimbabwe has been in crisis for, since the early 2000s. And there's a very recent history that seems to be repeating itself. So people are tired of hearing the same sort of messages. They're tired of a lack of movement taking place, and actually in many ways also this blame that is being attributed to externals rather than a real sort of self-reflection on what actually internally needs to be done to sort of overcome the political and economic crisis that's currently engulfing Zimbabwe.
Patricia, but these sanctions have been in place for almost 20 years, and we haven't seen any dramatic impact on the political establishment in Zimbabwe. Why would you assume or think that this time it could be different?
I don't think that there is going to be any difference to the current situation in Zimbabwe. These targeted sanctions that have been in place over 20 years and that change over time have had absolutely no impact, because the current government does not wish to see any change in behavior, to how they operate with regard to the political situation, as well as with regard to the electoral reforms, means that it might take away from them the power that they hold, the power to continue to plunder and loot the resources in Zimbabwe. It might take away from them the opportunity that they currently have to continue in their corrupt activities. So it's very difficult, really, to think that there would be any change at all in the removal of any targeted sanctions against individuals as well as organizations that are owned by the ZANU-PF leadership elites. and their inner circle, such as Secunda Holdings, and recently we were reading about some of the measures that had been put against Trafigura Holdings, but still that has no impact.
Aditi, under Robert Mugabe, the answer was clear and adamant. Sanctions are a violation of our national sovereignty. And we're seeing the same narrative by Mnangagwa. I mean, so any indication here that this government could make any concessions in the near future?
Just before I answer that question, I think what I want to add actually really on the previous point is regarding impact is to actually also say, I think what we're actually missing in the current analysis of Zimbabwe is, yes, on the one level, it is very much a business as usual sort of approach by government as a whole in terms of how they are perceiving their power relationship with their citizens. But actually, I think one of the very different things that is important for us to bear in mind with regard to ZANU right now is that it actually is a much more fractured political party and political entity than under President Mugabe. And so while on the one hand you can say that there's a skepticism around the fact that there's a lack of trust in the government, I think there are actually also elements within zanu-pf who are trying to implement the kind of reforms that are necessary, who are cognizant of the fact that it cannot be business as usual any longer. But it's because of the fractured nature of the politics of the political party at this point in time. There's actually a tussle, and it's almost like you see the schizophrenic sort of engagement between one arm of ZANU and the other. So on the one hand, they're sort of passing legislation that is supposed to sort of make access to information freer. They're addressing the POSA, the Public Order Bill. But then on the other hand, there are these constantly going out and arresting and abusing human rights activists and trying to violently quash political protest. So just to add that,
sure.
I think.
Patricia, the international community, the EU and the US in particular, are saying that they want to see some irreversible reforms, particularly when it comes to the election law reforms and the media reform. Do you think that the government ultimately will have to make some concessions when it comes to the election reform?
Yes, I think that the government needs to do something, but I think what we know is that it's not going to be possible for the government to make any concessions. The government is not willing to change, as we have already touched on the fact that sanctions have been imposed on these targeted groups of individuals and organizations. They have been asked to reform. They have been asked to ensure that there is rule of law in the country, and we are not seeing any change of movement from the current government. It is unlikely that they are going to change. I think what is needed is a new government. What is needed for Zimbabwe today is new leadership, because the longer that the current ZANU-PF-led government stays in power, we are going to see a continuation of the human rights abuses that we have witnessed on the 1st of August 2018, that we witnessed in January when 17 people were killed and 50 women raped, and just most recently on the 18th of October 2019, a young vendor, a young man who was out trying to earn a living, was assaulted by the police, and he died in custody, and nobody has been held accountable. I doubt very much that there is going to be any change across any area within Zimbabwe, either politically, economically, or media reforms.
One of the key sectors, Aditi, where the US in particular is looking forward to see some change, which is basically the reform of the security apparatus in Zimbabwe to put an end to the clamp down on human rights activists. How do you see a possible reform of that apparatus when the establishment itself remains intact?
I don't think that it is very likely. I think we've written about this before, actually. It really is. It's simply because of the way in which it's not just the political leaders in Zimbabwe that are corrupt. It is actually also the institutions that lend themselves to abuse. And, so you've got this 2013 constitution that is actually quite progressive, but very little movement has taken place in order to have the legislation comply to that. And I think, security sector reform is something that is going to necessitate a configuration of the relationship between the state apparatus and the military, which at the moment I don't think is likely, especially considering that in the post-Mugabe era, the military has ascended in many ways to prominence within ZANU-PF, and has actually sort of taken on a more public role in the sort of daily management of the government, where they weren't in the past.
Patricia, there are others who would say that if you continue as the opposition riding the wave of the sanctions, people might perceive that because of the sanctions, they're facing the reality that they are facing, and therefore this could just backfire as far as you are concerned.
I don't think that is the position. There needs to be some change for the people of Zimbabwe. But what I can say is that the current government is antagonizing the organizations that are giving aid to the country. They are not paying attention to the fact that change has been called for over the many years, and that actually, in order for us to move ahead, we need the government to be a listening government and to pay attention to the needs of the people of Zimbabwe.
Aditi, when you have food shortage, when you have poverty, when you have inflation, what do you think should come first, sanctions or the call for a broad, inclusive national dialogue?
I mean, I think that there are already calls for a broad, inclusive national dialogue. I think that my issue regarding sanctions, because I don't think that the focus on sanctions is necessarily 100% incorrect. I think that they definitely do act as a deterrent for investment into Zimbabwe. Definitely a lot of the international community that are based in Zimbabwe, that when I spoke to them in August, look to the US for direction in terms of how to engage with Zimbabwe. So there is definitely some truth to that. But I think that what has to come with that discussion around alleviating sanctions has to be continued pressure on the government in terms of pushing for the kinds of reforms that are necessary to really sort of transform Zimbabwe politically into something that's a little bit more accountable, transparent, and representative of its people. So my point regarding sanctions and SADC, and actually even I see the AU has also lent its weight behind this, for me is that if there is that solidarity from the part of the region to support this call for a dropping of the sanctions, I think there has to be a concomitant political intervention on the part of SADC, on the part of the African Union, to be able to place the pressure or to be able to assist Zimbabwe in that political transformation that is absolutely necessary.
Patricia, why isn't the African Union leading the effort to start genuine reconciliation, genuine reform in Zimbabwe?
I think because they have seen that there is a need to re-engage. They know that without that re-engagement, there could be a destabilization of the Southern Africa region if the current situation persists in Zimbabwe. I think also I wanted to add to what I'd earlier said about the role of SADC, particularly with regard to the call for sanctions. What that means is that it could actually be a real threat to democracy in Southern Africa if a whole block of countries are standing up together without challenging a government that has clearly breached its own constitution that it signed up to. So I think that the African Union have seen the need to renegotiate, to come to the table, to discuss, to make sure that the country can move forward and to bring together to the table all of the key stakeholders and interested parties to progress the country.
Aditi, and this is the problem that people say, that basically they were expecting SADC, which is the South African Development Community, to take over, to be the one leading the efforts to end this. And they seem to be completely disconnected, in denial about the agony of the people in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, I mean, it's for a political analyst that has been studying SADC for a number of years now, I would say that I don't think that I'm necessarily surprised. I don't think SADC has been particularly representative of human rights issues in the region as a whole. I think, last year we saw the way in which it treated the elections in the DRC and its approach to the sort of 2-year delay that it took for the elections to be held in the DRC as an indication for me that it's not going to, it's not particularly sort of concerned with that element, and it really is just in terms of politics, it seems to be dominated by the sense of solidarity politics between former liberation movements who have now become governments, and there's this sort of a doctrine that was instituted, I think, under President Mbeki, which people still sort of allude to now, which is this idea of quiet diplomacy, that there's not going to be a public pronouncement calling out the government of Zimbabwe, but they would deliberate behind the scenes. I'm not aware that there has been consistent and vociferous engagement with the government behind the scenes definitely in the past year since the elections took place.
Okay, Patricia, I mean, we understand the situation as it is. We know about the political impasse in Zimbabwe. My question to you, do you think from your own perspective as a member of a representative of the opposition party Movement for Democratic Change, that if there's any chance in the near future for a power-sharing agreement that would pave the way to a transition to democracy in Zimbabwe, would you jump in?
No, I think that we're very clear about that. President Chamisa has spoken on this issue on many occasions. We are asked about it very often. But we do not think that that would work. If you remember back to 2003 to 18, we were in government of national unity. And in those 5 years were the most successful years for Zimbabwe as a country. And soon after, the ruling party, ZANU-PF, decided to go it alone. Now, with all that we witness in the country, the lack of human rights, the lack of rule of law, the corruption, and the lack of addressing issues would mean that we don't think that that is the way we would want to go. What we would like to see in terms of discussions is getting around the table, having some national discussions with key stakeholders facilitated by non-political entity, and we want a new government. We are ready as the MDC to form the next government, and we think that ZANU-PF's time is up, really.
Aditi, in less than 30 seconds, if the situation continues as it is, how do you see the future of Zimbabwe?
Not very good. I think it's a very bleak picture. You've mentioned already power cuts, poverty. It's hurtling towards 50 million Zimbabweans next year will be food insecure. There's no electricity. There's no water. There's a risk of cholera. And that's just the sort of human security challenges. There's significant challenges that Zimbabwe needs to overcome. I think that it's not impossible for it to do so, but it does need to actually sort of show more earnestly that it is willing to undertake the reforms that are necessary.
Thank you.
And sort of move away from this mentality of we won't reform ourselves out of power.
Good to talk to you, Aditi, Lalbahadur, Patricia Chinyo. Thank you very much indeed for your contribution to the program. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.